Welcome back to the channel, Real Repairs for Real Customers. I have had the request for a steering wheel wrap, a complete wrap, and of course that's not the kind of work I do on a daily basis here. However, over the years I have discovered some basic principles, and I thought we could demonstrate those basic principles for the benefit of our repair community. So by all means, don't consider this as the authority on this by any stretch of the imagination. Just take these basic principles and use those in designing your own wrap for your own particular steering application. There are so many variables that we're not going to discuss all of those. For example, you've seen already on this channel where we have pre-punched with a hand punch that we can sew through those holes. On this prototype here for this Piper yoke, we did the same thing. You could also, in the case of the one we have today, we're going to use the sewing machine to run our contrast stitching. Or, optionally, you could use the sewing machine with no thread and just pre-punch the holes with the machine. So there are endless options as far as styling and so forth. Our request has been for a basic wrap today, so that's good. In fact, the object of our wrap is this Chevy step van. This is being customized for a beer wagon. And the request has been for a black leather wrap with red contrast stitching. So let's discuss some basic principles and let's get on with it. So to mount the wheel, I had to grab an extra 1/2-inch drive socket for a spacer. And that way it all fit nicely into my highly customized scrap wood jig. Not everybody's privileged to have such a specialized piece of equipment, but I wouldn't steer you wrong. So here what I can do to measure the outside diameter, I can hold my finger here and put 2 on the left side, and I can move this to where it's tight, and as soon as it gets tight here, that's the point, that's the diameter. So I'm 50 and a half, so that gives us 2 from 50 and a half is 48 and a half. So I have the outside diameter is 48 and a half centimeters. Now I can do the same for the inside. Let's hold the number 2 right on the inside and come down here and do the same thing. And we get 46 and a half. Let's make sure we got our 2 there. Yeah, 46 and a half. So that gives us 44 and a half. 44 and a half, and that's the inside diameter. Let's see what we can do with those figures. So we know from very basic geometry that the circumference equals pi d, right? So we can use our calculator and we can find the circumference of the outside of the wheel, okay, by multiplying 48.5 times pi, 152.36. Let's round it down. Let's just call it 152 centimeters. Okay? The circumference of the inside of the wheel will be 44.5 times pi, 139.8. Let's go 140. We'll round that. Okay? So there we go. So here's the situation. We've got a wheel where the inside circumference is smaller, of course, than the outside circumference. If we made our leather wrap the size of the outside circumference, the 152, then it would be way too big for the inside. And what would happen is we'd have too much leather in there and it would bunch up. We'd have to gather it up and it wouldn't look good. How about if we took the inside dimension, 140 centimeters, and stretched the leather? Would it stretch enough to make the 152? Well, that's a good question. So let's see. So I have a piece of scrap leather here. There was already an existing mark, so let's use that mark. We'll put our measuring tape to the end of the leather, and that mark is at 47.5 centimeters. I'm going to mark that down. 47.5 centimeters. Now I can hold the tape and the leather on this end, and let's stretch this mark comfortably. Okay, so that's pretty good. I mean, that's tight. 50. We can go to 50 centimeters. Okay. Let's see how that helps us. Okay, what percentage is that? Well, we could use X for the percentage. So 47.5 times X gives us our 50. All right. So we know that's simple algebra. We can divide each side by 47.5 and solve for X. Okay, so let's take 50 divided by 47.5, and we get 1.5. 1.05, sorry. So we have 1, we have the original, plus we have an additional 5%. So we could say that the leather stretches 5%. Okay, what if we tried to stretch the 140 5%? Okay, wanted to stretch that 140. Okay, so 140 times 1.05 would give us what? Well, let's see. 140 times 1.05 gives us 147. Okay, so if we took the inside circumference and stretched it reasonably, we would still only get 147 centimeters for the outside. So we're still 5 centimeters short. Can we make up some of that 5 centimeters? Well, let's see. These two scraps of leather are going to represent a single piece wrap that has two ends that are cut at 90 degrees. Let's see how they join up. Let's pay attention to that. So we'll just fix it on here with some tape. Do the same thing with the other end. Now when the ends touch on the inside of the wheel, there's a gap on the outside of the wheel. That shows us that instead of cutting these at 90 degrees, we can cut them so there's extra length in the middle to make up this difference. If we could get by adding 1 centimeter for each joint, then if we made our wrap out of 4 separate pieces, we would have 4 joints, and we could add 4 centimeters to our outside circumference. And we also want to measure the grip. We can just wrap our tape around, take any two numbers and subtract, And so here we have 7 centimeters. But it's not consistent throughout this wheel. If we turn it, we find as we get closer to the spoke arms, see, it's actually a little bit larger. So we have a variable between 7 and 8 centimeters. It might be wise for us to make a piece of leather that is actually a good bit wider, since the width of our grip will have to be customized over the entire wheel. When we get to the spoke, we have the option to leave it a raw cut, or we can fold under and have a folded, neat trimmed edge. And at that point, we can run the stitching right straight across there, or we can stop the stitching at the spoke. So those are some options for you, depending on your application. And I've chosen an arbitrary figure of 20 centimeters for our side pieces. So then, for each piece of leather that we make our wheel out of, if we divided it into 4 parts, for example, for each part we add 1 centimeter. So that means that if we make our steering wrap out of 4 parts, then we will add, right, that will add 4 centimeters to our 147. And look, that would bring us to 151. And at 151 centimeters, look at there, we're 1 centimeter short of our outside circumference. Now the spokes are not at the 3 o'clock and the 9 o'clock position. They're slanted down, leaving room here at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock for a hand grip. So that being the case, if we made the top piece of leather and the bottom piece of leather the same size, then there would be room for a grip at 3 and 9 o'clock. If we divided it into four parts, we could have 2 short ones at 20, right? So we had 2 pieces at 20. We could have 2 pieces at 50. Okay? But remember, we're going to add 1 centimeter, a half a centimeter to each end. So that makes this one 21, and makes this one 51. Now the other thing is we have to sew these together. So we need a seam allowance. Let's say that we use 1 centimeter as a seam allowance. Well, that would be on either end. So we have to add 2 centimeters for the seam allowance. That would bring this up to 23. Okay? 23, 53. Okay? This includes the seam allowance. Okay? And this includes, let's call this the makeup. That's the 1 centimeter makeup, so that we add a total of 4 centimeters to our outside circumference. Now the grip we said was 7 to 8 centimeters. Let's just make the grip 10 centimeters, and that gives us something to play with so we don't come up short on that. So that's our plan. The other benefit of using 4 pieces of leather instead of 1 is you get to make the entire steering wheel wrap out of scraps. You don't need one continuous long piece of hide. And I'm sure you've seen wheels that have 2 different colors, 2 pieces out of one color and 2 pieces out of the other for contrast. This would be a good place to sell some scraps of suede or perforated leather as well. Now remember, each one of our strips is long in the middle to make up this outside circumference. So then on the sides that represent the inside circumference of our wheel, we want to subtract that 1/2 centimeter. Now each of our 4 pieces will be 1 centimeter longer, a 1/2 on each end. Since we're going to be sewing 2 pieces together, it would be nice if each piece of leather was 1/2 the thickness. So we're going to use the skiving tool for that. There is power equipment designed to do this. We just don't do enough of it to merit that kind of investment here. So of course, if you plan for 1 centimeter of seam allowance, you want to make sure you use up all that centimeter when you're sewing. Now this leather that's been left as a seam allowance, that can be glued and trimmed and tamped down flat to make it easier for your wrap to lie down on the steering wheel. Now in preparation for trimming, I have marked the location of the spokes so that we can reassemble it exactly in the same position. And what I'm doing is making sure each side of the wheel is even. And then on one side here, I am marking right at the crown of the steering, at the top of the rounded part. Make sure that each side is even. And the reason for that is we know that the center of this piece has to be on the crown of the outside of the wheel. So as we go around, this can be adjusted side to side. You have to be careful, so make sure they're lined up together and then mark the crown of the inside circumference. Now we can start trimming all the way around. Now I'm leaving a little extra at the spoke. Remember, we're going to fold it under and leave a folded edge on the spokes. You could leave a raw edge if you wanted to. It's your call. We're doing this one with a folded edge. We could do the next one differently. So now we're preparing to mark and trim the far edge. In order to do this, I need to make sure that the first edge that I cut is lined up right on the crown. And then we can fold the other edge under that and mark it. It would be the same as if we had double cut this originally on the crown. Now we can totally remove the wrap, and now we're trimming on that far edge. And because we have our marks for the spokes, we know that this is going on exactly as we took it off. And we can do a test fit just to make sure everything is good. And it is. Okay, it's time for our first contrast stitch down one side. And here where stitching is critical, you can yank on the bobbin thread and pull the top thread through. Then on the bottom side of the leather here, you can tie a knot. Just tie a square knot and trim. And now down the other side. And now especially because this wheel is painted and very slippery, I want to use some contact cement. We'll put some on the wheel itself and some on the leather. Let that dry to the point that it's tacky. I believe this is going to be necessary to keep the leather from spinning around on the grip. Now I'm going around and pressing everything into position, making sure that that center joint lines right up. Here I'm using some cleaner to take off my marks. And then if there's any excess glue that's oozing out from the seam, I'm going to use xylene and clean that up too. Now for the hand stitching here, I'm using straight blunt tip needles. And this is essential because you don't want the needles to be cutting any of your existing thread. You want it to be able to slide by the stitching you put on with the sewing machine. So you need about 4 times as much length per section on your thread. I am anchoring the end straight across to give it a neat trim look on the end. And there are many choices on stitching here. What I've elected to do with this one is take my leading side, and instead of coming straight across, I'm coming straight across and going up 2 stitches. And when I come across again, coming back, I'll go forward 2 stitches again. And the second thread coming along, we'll divide that in half. The reason for doing it this way is I wanted as much red on this wheel as possible. And speaking of which, the request was made for red, and you see how nice and red the paint is here. But if we went with what's called red thread, it would be a dark red, and therefore would not be a contrast. It wouldn't be in contrast for value. So in order to contrast to the black leather, we have to use what's called crimson thread in this case. So your biggest investment here will be time. So that will about wrap it up for a discussion of the basics. The customer was very happy with this. It's just exactly what he was wishing for. Now if he would just get finished with this beer wagon, I know exactly where the tap is on the side. Before you go, I'd like to introduce you to Robin Lewis. It was 27 years ago I helped Robin get up and running with his business. And running is right because he left the rest of us in the dust. And he's agreed to share some pictures with us of one of his passions in life, and that is competitive fly fishing.